Hello guys, welcome to week 19 Viva from Arkansas. Okay, wait, this got messed up. Story, okay, so week 19's question was, how did the legacy of World War II play out in the years following the final conclusion of the conflict? So although we tend to think of World War II as being a good war, and its real legacy was extremely complicated and multi-faced, the years following the war were a strange fog of confusion as survivors of World War II dealt with its legacy and sought to create a new world out of ashes from the old world. And it did this through changing perspectives of good and evil. It reconstructed the world into a image of America, and it left permanent mental scars on the survivors of the war. Okay, so my first point is that it changed the perspectives of good and evil that was seen throughout the world. A lot of military innovations, of the final years of the war were a big deal, and they really were kind of a scale of the Holocaust, and this kind of changed good versus evil. There was, we know about the death camps and concentration camps, firebombing and nuclear attacks were all part of these military innovations that were kind of first used in World War II. So, Nazis, how they ran their death camps and concentration camps was a lot like the slaughterhouses, and the slaughterhouses were pretty nasty. They would just kind of run all the animals in, kill them. They would be living in horrible conditions before they killed them, and it's not a great thing to be in a slaughterhouse, as you can probably imagine. And back then they didn't really they didn't have a lot of dignity for animals, and so the Nazis really treated their captives as animals and prey, and instead of hunting them in the wild, because hunting is more respectable than just caging up animals and shooting them or just chopping their heads off, instead of hunting out these people in the wild and murdering them, they cooped them all up in a death camp or slaughterhouse, and they just killed them all, which is completely awful. A good story about this is P.J. Wodehouse. So he was a British humorist and author during the time period. I don't know what's wrong with me. And he lived in France with his wife, who he nicknamed Plummy. It's kind of a fun fact, if somebody calls you Plummy, he's a keeper. So they lived in France in this beautiful house, and they had beautiful gardens and stuff, and they didn't really take the German threat or invasion of other countries that seriously, and so they didn't leave because they were like, whatever, we have time, but then it was too late, and the Germans came into France, and they kind of trapped them in their house and wouldn't let them leave France. So, it's kind of funny. Plummy the wife was looking out the window, and she saw some German soldiers, and she was like, Woodhouse saw some German soldiers, and he was like, Plummy, the German army is in our backyard. And so, just kind of funny, because I feel like this couple was kind of clueless with the war. And so they were taken to a internment camp, and Woodhouse was kind of it's kind of funny because they all got jammed in the like the train cars, and he was like, he asked one of the guards, he was like, "Where are we going?" And the guard was like, "Upper Silesia." And then he was like, "If this is Upper Silesia," he's like, "what on earth must Lower Silesia be like?" So he was just like a total like British humor person, and it was really great. And so the Germans were big fans of him and his writing and his humor, and so they actually gave him a typewriter and they kind of made him write stories for them. And Woodhouse didn't want special treatment because they wanted to, you know, give him like more food or a extra blanket or stuff like that, and he was like, "No, I want to suffer with these other prisoners." And so they decide to take him to Berlin, where they kind of force him to do radio programs, and they force him to say that the Germans are really nice and they're treating their prisoners well and stuff like that, which was obviously a lie. So oh, hi Delilah. So obviously that was a lie, but he did it anyways, and that's kind of where he lived out the remainder of his years, because England didn't want him to return because they looked at him as a traitor, because he kind of didn't take Germany's side, but he kind of protected them and lied about the conditions of the prisoners in the camps. And so this is devastating for him because England is his country and he can never go back, and so it's really sad for him. And this is just one example of how the Nazis really destroyed people's lives outside of you know, like the concentration camps, because obviously they destroyed people's lives in the concentration camps with the Jews and how they treated, you know, American soldiers and Jews and all of that. It was awful and horrible, and so that obviously destroyed a lot of people's lives, and kind of entering our third point, you know, left a lot of mental scars on people. But also they, like, people who weren't imprisoned, or like J.P. Woodhouse, they really destroyed their lives with either, you know, putting them under pressure to treat different people groups a certain way, or what they did to Woodhouse, where they just totally took away his British dignity and stuff like that. So it's pretty crazy, and it's something we don't normally think about as part of the kind of good and evil. So that's kind of an example of how the death camps worked. And another example of just kind of these military innovations is firebombing. And so this is where they would take bombs and they would drop them on cities, and the bombs would turn into fires and they would suffocate, and they would just kill tons of people this way. And so before this, like, the wars were kind of like soldiers fighting soldiers, and the civilians really didn't involve civilians. But then during this World War II with the firebombing, they were firebombing cities, and so they were targeting innocent civilians, like children and women and people who didn't really have, like, didn't want to be a part of the war or shouldn't have been a part of the war. And so all of these things, and then obviously nuclear attacks with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and just the true horrors of nuclear warfare. And so all of these kind of crazy events after World War II that are kind of discovered really affect people's view on good versus evil. So we kind of can see this in three different, like, symbols. The first one is that the Nazi Party after World War II is obviously looked down upon as pure evil and really becomes this image of pure evil. I don't know why I keep using my hands. And another kind of a symbol or thing that kind of changed was at the end of the war, like, war is kind of seen as evil and destructive and wrong, because during World War II, it no longer just affected political stuff, and it was no longer kind of justified by foreign policies or different, you know, political events. It was killing innocent people and, having concentration camps and death camps and nuclear warfare and stuff like that. Like, that is not just involving soldiers and world leaders and stuff like that. So people started to look on war as something bad versus a political tool for foreign policies. I'm losing my cards. I thought it was warm out, but it's getting cold, so whatever. Karl von Clausewitz, I know I said that wrong, says, quote, "The war is a more continuation of politics by other means," end quote. And so he's basically just saying that war used to be something that was used for political gain and political power, and now after World War II it really turned into something evil and wrong and nasty, which changed the perception of good and evil. So kind of the last thing that changes perspectives and stuff is the banality of evil. So evil becomes seen as something that's a part of all humans, and evil is seen as ignorance that is fixed with knowledge. So people start to believe that the more knowledge you gain and the less violent you become, which I think it was kind of proven. I think we talked about maybe last semester, but like having a higher IQ, people are kind of less violent than when you have a lower IQ. So having knowledge fixes ignorance. If you feel ignorant, go read a book. And this kind of idea leads to the belief that there really are no heroes and villains in the world. Again, we talked about this in the beginning of the year, how you can't just see one side of a person, and I've learned this from life experience, shockingly, this last kind of month, that you cannot look at people as one-sided, as one thing or one, thing that they accomplished, like Hitler or Columbus during the debate we'll be talking about. But, people are a whole, and we have to know that everyone is created in God's image, and because of that, everybody is going to have kind of a piece of God's heart, or have something special about them where you can really see God's creation and beauty in them. But again, people are inherently evil, and so that is going to really affect people. But again, people are all rounded. That means if somebody's sad once in a while or happy, you have to accept different emotions and different sides of people and not look at them as, or label them as one thing. Sorry, this is like something I'm passionate about because of some stuff that happened this past month. But goes for heroes and villains as well. You cannot just label somebody as a hero or villain, or as the smart kid or the weird kid or the dark kid or the emotional person or the scary stalker. You can't do that, so stop doing that, people, because it's wrong, and this is going to change your perception of good and evil, which I feel like we've kind of lost that today. So maybe we need another war to change our perspective on this. I'm just kidding. Don't quote me on that. Okay, whatever. Who's gonna watch this anymore? It's like 3 years old. Okay, whatever. Okay. So moving on to point 2. When a competitor wins a war, usually the losers learn from their components, their superiors. And they kind of try to copy them or become like them, so they get stronger and they learn from their mistakes. So they imitate the winning strategy, and this leads to kind of the reconstruction of the world to make little mini images of America throughout the world. And we can still see this today. So kind of the don't label people, but the losers of the war was really Japan and Germany, and they took the fall for the war, and they were blamed for the war. And so after this war, obviously war destroys a country, as we can see through previous wars. So Germany and Japan were destroyed, their landscape was destroyed, they were, very poor, out of money, people were destroyed, had a lot of mental scars. And it was just direct. And so Germany and Japan really wanted to be like America, because they saw that how America won the war, and just the values that America had are stronger than their own values. So there was this thing called the Marshall Plan, which I feel like I talked about last week, or I guess whatever week that was, because I'm behind. So anyways, the Marshall Plan, it gives America basically gives a lot of money to the loser countries like Germany and Japan, and this makes the world kind of love America, because who doesn't love free money? Because, you know, America won the war, so they were thriving, their economy was thriving, they were thriving, and so they gave some of their money away to kind of the loser countries so they could kind of bring back their economy and their countries. So obviously makes America, which is this new rising world power, really popular with a bunch of different countries. And it shows how capitalism is way better than communism, and how capitalism works better than communism. And so, great life goal right there. Yeah, so George Marshall says, quote, "The remedy lies in breaking the vicious circle," end quote. And so, you know, basically, Germany and Japan kind of want to start copying America in a lot of ways. And that's the basic idea of that. The world becomes mini America. You're welcome. I don't know what's wrong with me today. Okay, whatever. I've been alone too long. Okay. So my third and final point of this Viva is that the war and the violence done during this war left a permanent scar on the psyches of those who participated in it. So this includes the soldiers, but I also think it includes the people who were in the concentration camps. Obviously the German soldiers and the Japanese soldiers, and, you know, people who had to work in those concentration camps and like do those awful nasty things to people, like that's a lot to live with. So there's, you know, those people, there's the victims of the war, who were, you know, the Jews and soldiers and different people who were in the concentration camps. Again, civilians, this war was the first war that really affected civilians. So after the war, like, everybody is really affected and has these emotional scars, and it just gets a lot of emotional health issues. So again, obviously a lot of people self-medicate, and they go to drinking and drugs and smoking and different cults. Cults. My favorite. Sorry. Okay, so Strangers on the Train we listened to, which is kind of just this, captures this eerie, dark time period after the war, and it really, again, kind of shows this change of perspective in good and evil, like our first point talks about, with the man who's going to kill the other man's wife as a favor. So it's a kind of, you know, this drama is obviously a psychological thriller, and somebody's here. Hi. We don't get many visitors. And so there are themes of good and evil again, and it really shows that during this time period after the war, and it kind of shows this PTSD like mindset throughout the program. So cults, let's talk a little bit about cults. Scientology this was the second American cult that was formed right after Mormonism, and it was formed out of World War II. And it kind of, if you listen to the founding story of Scientology and what they think, you know, where the world came from and humans and all the worldview questions and stuff, it kind of mirrors World War II and kind of like replays that history, which is really interesting. So this is kind of the story of Scientology and what they believed, how the world works. So they believed that there was a nuclear war in space which killed everybody, and their ghosts began to haunt people today. And so they give them all of their flaws and all of their evil. And so evil comes from ghosts from space who are haunting us. So, I don't really know how you get rid of those, but I'm sorry. So again, this mirrors World War II because there was a lot of nuclear warfare and a lot of people died and there was a lot of evil, and yeah, so bad times, but really mimics World War II. And so World War II really left permanent scars on people and, you know, led to a lot of self-medication, like cults and other unhealthy coping skills. So if I end this Viva, I'm gonna say that my thesis is that although we tend to look at World War II as being this good, positive world where America won and things were amazing, World War II has a complex history, a complex legacy, and the years following the war were a strange fog of confusion, and the survivors of World War II dealt with its legacy and sought to create a new world out of the ashes of the old world. And again, we can see this through people changing their perspectives of good and evil, the reconstruction of the world to kind of look like in a mini America, and the permanent mental scars that it left on the survivors of the... Okay, thank you so much. I'll see you later.